In this tutorial, you will learn how to create a full-stack web application from scratch using MySQL for the database, Python Django for the backend, and Vue JS for the front end. We will first start with installing and setting up the environment for the project. Then we create the Python Django project with the required REST API endpoints using Django REST framework. Finally, we will use Vue JS for creating the front end. You will learn how to add routing for our app. Create Bootstrap Table with custom sorting and filtering capabilities. Add modal pop-up window with drop-downs and date pickers. We will also learn how to upload an image and store it in the backend server. Welcome to the course and happy learning. Let's install Python. We will be installing Python from the official website. Also choose to add Python to path. Let's verify the installation from command prompt. The installation was successful. Let's install Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a popular lightweight code editor from Microsoft. It is mostly used for front-end web development. Let's install Postman. We will be using Postman to test our REST APIs. Let's install My Sql Workbench. We will be using My Sql Workbench to connect to a MySQL database and create the necessary database objects. Let's install the necessary modules needed for our Django project. First, let's install the Django module. To create REST APIs, we need to install Django REST framework. By default, the Django project comes with a security that blocks requests coming from different domains. To disable this, let's install Django Core's headers module. Now let's create the Django project. Open the command prompt in the desired folder and type the command. Django admin start project and the name of the project. Let's open Visual Studio Code inside the project path. Let's take a look at some of the important files in the project. Init.py file is just an empty file that indicates that the given folder is a Python project or a Python module. ASGI.py is the entry point for the ASGI compatible web servers. WSGI.py is the entry point for the WSGI compatible web servers. URLs.py file contains all the URL declarations needed for this project. Settings.py file contains all the settings or the configurations needed for the project. Manage.py is a command line utility that helps interact with the Django project. Let's simply run the project and see how it looks in the browser. Just type python space manage py space run server. The app is now running in the port 8000. Let's copy the URL and open in the browser. What you see on the screen is the default template that comes with every Django project. Now let's create an app in our Django project. Quick difference between projects and apps. The folder structure that you currently see on the screen is called the project. A project may have multiple apps. For example, you can have one app which acts like a blog, or maybe another app which acts like a survey form. Currently, this project does not have any app. Let's create one app to implement our API methods. To create an app, we need to type this command: python space manage.py space start app space the name of the app. Next, let us register the app and the required modules in settings.py file. In the installed apps section, let's add REST framework, CORS header, and the newly created app. We need to add the CORS headers in middleware section as well. We will also add instruction to enable all domains to access the APIs. This is not recommended in production. Instead, just add only those domains that needs to be whitelisted. Let's create the models needed for our app. We need two models, one to store department details and another one to store employee details. The department's model will have two fields, one to store an auto-incremented department ID and another one to store department name. Employee model will have 5 fields: employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining, and photo file name, which stores the uploaded profile picture file name. We will be using MySQL as the database to create the tables from these models. Let's open up My Sql Workbench. I have already procured a MySQL server from Azure Database Service and will be connecting to the same. Let's create a database for our app. To connect to MySQL from our Python app, we need to install the database adapter. Let's install it with the command pip install py-mysql. Let us now add the database connection details in settings file. With Python 3, there is an issue with this database client. To fix it, we need to add couple of lines. Now let's create the tables from these models. Let's write the command to make migrations file for our models. After executing this, we can see a migration file which tells us what changes to the database will be done. Once it looks fine, we can execute the command to push these changes to the database. Let's now refresh the database. We see that the database tables are now created. Let's run select query on them. We see that currently we don't have any data. Let's insert some record into it. Let's create serializers for our models. Serializers basically help to convert the complex types or model instances into native Python data types that can then be easily rendered into JSON or XML or other content types. They also help in deserialization, which is nothing but converting the past data back to complex types. Let's now start writing the API methods. Open vue.py file. We are importing CSRF decorator to be able to allow other domains to access our API methods. We need JSON parser to parse the incoming data into data model. Let's import the models that we created. And also the corresponding serializer classes. Let's write our API methods for departments table. The method will receive an optional ID which we will need to use in the delete method. In get method we will return all the records in JSON format. We are making use of serializer class to convert it into JSON format. The parameter safe equal to false is basically used to inform Django that what we are trying to convert to JSON is actually a valid format and we are fine if there are still any issues in it. Let's write post method which will be used to insert new record into departments table. We are parsing the request and using the serializer to convert it into model. If the model is valid, we save it into the database and return success message. Next, let's complete the put method, which will be used to update a given record. First, we are capturing the existing record using department ID. Next, we are mapping it with new values using Serializer class. And save it if the model is valid. Finally, let's implement the delete method. We will be passing the ID to be deleted from the URL. Let's now add routes to specify the URLs for our API methods. Add a new file urls.py. The delete method will receive ID in the URL. Next, we need to include these URLs in the main urls.py file. Now let's test our API methods. Let's first start the project using the command python space manage.py space run server. Let's test get method, which returns all data from the table. We see that get method works as expected. Let's test the post method to insert new data. The post method also works, and we can verify it by calling the get method again. Let's test put method and update a record. The put method also works as expected. Finally, let's test the delete method. The delete method also works as expected. Let's now implement the API methods for employee table. Let's add the URL roots as well. Let's now test these APIs. We see that the employee API methods also work as expected. Let's add an API method to save the uploaded profile picture. To store the images, let's first create a folder in our app. To be able to use this folder, we need to add some instructions in the settings.py file. Now let's add the API method. We are making use of default storage module to save the file. Once it is saved, we simply return the file name. Let's add a URL root for our API method. Let's now test the API method by uploading a file. We see that the upload file API works as expected. Let's now create the Vue JS project. Navigate to the folder where we need the project and open Visual Studio Code. Let's create an index.html file. Let's add Bootstrap for styling our app. The styling reference goes in the head section of our HTML. And the bundle JavaScript reference can be added at the closing body tag. We will be using the CDN version of Vue JS for our front-end project. So let me add the JavaScript reference for Vue JS and Vue Router JS files. Vue Router is needed to add the routing capability for our app. We also need to save the API URL somewhere in our front end. So let's create a variable.js file and save the URLs in it. Let's also reference the variables.js file in index.html. We also need to include Axios library, which will be used to consume the API methods. Let's add the routing and navigation to our app. Let's first add a div tag with ID as app and add some headers. Let's see how it looks by opening the HTML file. Now let's add the components or the pages needed for our app. We will add 3 screens. One for home, one for department, and one for employee. We also need a root component inside which we will list the routing paths. Let's add it with name app.js. Let's add a simple template for each of these screens. The HTML is written inside 2 backticks. Let's add the routing paths. /home will be given for home component. and /employee for employee component. /department for department component. Let's create a Vue router object and pass the routes array. Now let's create a Vue object. This will be mounted to the element with ID app. This is the same ID that we used for our div. Now let's add the navigation menu. Router link is the tag that will help with routing. Let's check if this works. We need to add one more tag called routerView to make this work. Let's add class container to our div. Looks like we have not referenced the JS files. Let's do it. We have not changed the component constant names in JS files. We see that the routing and navigation works as expected. Let's consume the get method and display the data in a grid. Inside data, we can declare all the variables that we can use inside the template. I am declaring an empty array which will be populated using the getAPI method. In the methods section, let's write a method to consume the getAPI method. We are making use of Axios to consume the API methods. Once the response is received, we will assign the data to the departments array. There is a lifecycle method called mounted which will be called when this component is in scope. We will call the refresh method here. Now let's add the Bootstrap table to display our data. We will loop through the department arrays using v for directive. In the options column, we will add two buttons. One to edit the record, and another one to delete a record. Let's add Bootstrap icons inside these buttons. Let's check how it looks. Looks like we missed a closing t-head tag. The grid seems to look fine now. Let's add the modal pop-up window to add and edit the department. Let's add the modal title from variable since we will be using same modal for adding and editing. Let's define the modal title variable. Also, we need form fields department name and department ID inside the modal. Let's add the text box for department name. The vModel directive gives us two-way binding, so the value entered in the text box will be available in the department name variable. Let's add two buttons, one to create new department, another one to update the department. The Create button will be visible when department ID is set to 0. Now let's add the button to open the modal window. This button will be to add new department. Same functionality on click of Edit Department. On Add click, we will set the title to Add Department and Department ID to 0. And on Edit click, we set the title to Edit Department. We see that modal window works as expected. Now let's add functionality to create and update departments using the API URLs. Once response is available, we display the message in alert box and also refresh the grid. Let's test the functionality. We see that the create and update functionalities work as expected. Now let's complete the delete method. We will pass the department ID to the delete function. We will take the confirmation before calling the delete API. We see that delete also works as expected. Let's complete employee details screen. We will copy the contents from department screen and make changes accordingly. The modal window will now have more form fields and image to be displayed. So let's use Bootstrap Flex. Department field will be a drop-down. The option values will come from departments array. Date of joining will be a date field. Now let's add a div to display profile picture. The image source will come from variables. Let's also add upload button for uploading new images. The photo path is already defined in variables.js file. We will use the same. In refresh data method, we will refresh both employee and departments array. Let's now add method to upload the image. We will attach the first file to form data. Once upload is successful, we will replace the photo file name variable. We see that the screen is now displaying data. Let's check the create and update functionalities. Finally, let's test the delete method. We see that all the functionalities in employee screen work as expected. Let's implement sorting and filter feature. Let's do it for departments table. Let's start with filtering. We need text box to enter the filter text. We will be using department ID filter variable to store the filter text. We will execute the filter function each time new letter is entered. Let's add a filter text box for department name column as well. Along with filter variables, we also add one more array which will store backup data without any filters. Now let's implement the filter function. We will be using includes method to check if the filter text matches with the array data. Let's check the functionality. We see that filtering works as expected. Now let's implement sorting feature. We will add 2 buttons for sorting. One to sort in ascending, and another one to sort data in descending. If we pass true, it means we need to sort it by ascending. Let's add icons for the filter buttons. Now let's implement the sorting function. Let's check the result. Looks like we made an error while passing parameters. We see that the sorting works fine now.